All right. So my name is Deke Arndt, and Kevin Bates will introduce himself. I'm a climate scientist from Asheville and a member of the St. Eugene's Catholic Parish on the north side of Asheville. And Kevin, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I'm Kevin Bates. I am a United Methodist pastor in the Upper Swannanoa River watershed, which is Black Mountain, Montreat, Swannanoa area for those of you who are familiar with it. And I've been a pastor working with rural communities for a while now on these issues of climate and faith. And I'm always interested in the ways we tell our stories and the ways that we can connect with one another and learning how to love the creation as our response to what's happening around us. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later.
So I think we're the plan is I'll take about 25 minutes. We'll go through kind of a climate 101, do a little storytelling like Kevin alluded to. The the climate stuff can be a little bleak. It can be a little distressing. I just want to warn you ahead of time. The news hasn't changed. It's still an oppressive force on the vulnerable and a little bit on the rest of us too. But I do think there, hopefully through our storytelling and through our faith and Kevin's wonderful insights into both, we can find our best role in the face of climate. And Kevin, do you mind if I just jump in? Is that okay with you?
That's perfect.
All right, I'm going to share my screen, which is probably going to be a big disaster. I remember I used to make fun of my dad because he couldn't do the VCR clock. And now I'm at that phase of life myself. So here we go. I'll try to get this right. Share screen. Here we go. Can you see that? Can you see something that looks like a presentation?
Yes.
All right, awesome. Good deal. Okay, so I'm Deke Arndt, and please jump in if you do need if something needs to be clarified, if you have a question about any of this. I'm a climate scientist. I happen to work for the agency NOAA. I'm the chief of the climate science and climate services division there at the data center in Asheville, where all the world's kind of weather and climate data. But I'm here today more as a representative of Asheville's faith community and a real fan and supporter and someone who's inspired by the Creation Care Alliance and all of the folks associated with it. So what we'll talk about is just do a little bit of Science 101, not a whole lot, but answering two questions. How do we know the climate's changing? How do we know it's us? And the implied question on the back end of those is, if we know it's changing and we know it's us, then are we compelled to do something about it? A few vignettes on kind of how these changes are affecting different parts of our world's community and our nation's community. A quick story on what, and then an intro to what we do. And at that point, I'll hand off to Kevin, who's going to follow up with a much more, I think, faith-informed set of questions and reflections that maybe we can participate in. So just very quickly, how do we know climate is changing? One of the jobs that I had for 11 years was the group that calculates the global temperature. So all the weather data from around the world comes to Asheville, and one of the things we do with that is calculate the global temperature. And so this is a graph of the global temperature since 1880. We'll look at 3 or 4 graphs over the next 20 minutes or so. And on all of them, the left is the past and the right is the present. So we're walking through time from left to right to get to the present. And on this graph, dots that are above the line represent years that were warmer than the 20th century average, and by how much. And dots that are below the line are years that were cooler than the 20th century average for the planet. So you could see the last few years are about 1 degree Celsius or close to 2 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the 20th century average. And it's been a fairly steady climb. Each year kind of bounces around from year to year. But the overall pattern is pretty unmistakable. We've been warming for the last 50, 60 years. The blue bars are just the average for that decade. So it's the average of the 10 dots that make up the 10 individual years that make up that decade. So we continue to climb. We're going to keep climbing. 2 degrees Fahrenheit doesn't sound like a whole lot, but if you go adjust your house's thermostat by 2 degrees, you will notice a difference in the quality of your life. And in that way, many of the ecosystems and the people that depend on a relatively consistent climate are experiencing that thermostat kind of going up. This is just put in there for self-defense. We're not the only group around the world that does this. There's a group at NASA, there's a group at the Japanese Meteorological Agency, and then that HADCRUT 4 is a group of Brits, British folks that do the same thing. And basically based on whatever data sets we use and how we do the calculation, we're in pretty stark agreement that the world is warming. So each of these lines is our data set versus the other data sets around the world that are trying to calculate the same thing. And we're all singing the same song, even if we're hitting different notes kind of along the way. This is a map of how the country is warming. So what is the rate of change? So there's a bunch of graphs up here that are kind of distracting, but the map itself is really what is worth looking at. The map itself shows how fast different parts of the country are warming. And there's a couple good points to make here. One is not all parts of the world or the country are warming at the same rate. So the northern and western parts of the US have been warming the most in the last few decades. And the South is relatively flat. The South is kind of paying for global warming in ways other than temperature, or we're paying for it in a lot of additional rainfall and water, some of which is great, some of which is tragic. So just a point that global average that you see, the rate of warming is different, and the rate of warming tends to be concentrated in the cooler places. So the higher elevations and the higher latitudes closer to the poles, the cooler seasons. So for the most part, the cool parts of the year are warming faster than the warm parts of the year, and the colder times of day. So mornings and overnights are warming more than afternoons and evenings. All right, so how do we know it's us? There are lots of indicators of a warming world. We happened to look at air temperature, but there's dozens of indicators or variables that scientists can analyze, and they all agree the world is warming. So this shows 10 of the most prominent indicators. Humidity's up. We're living in a moister atmosphere. Sea levels coming up. Different types of temperatures are coming up. The amount of heat that's stored in the ocean is going up. Frozen stuff in general is going down. So glaciers, snow cover, and sea ice is going down. And these all agree that the world is warming. They all clearly indicate the world is warming, but they don't themselves say why. And so a good question is, how do we know why? And so one other indicator, a driver, the ultimate driver of all this change are greenhouse gases. So this is dated a little bit. The 2020 data is not quite out yet. We're compiling that now, but we are seeing increases in these 3 major greenhouse gases. So greenhouse gases are carbon dioxide on top, methane in the middle, and nitrous oxide on the bottom. And these all act kind of in concert to trap more heat down at the surface of the Earth. And in theory, greenhouse gases work by slowing down the escape of heat into space. And so the more greenhouse gases you add, the more of a blanket effect that you're having. Hey, Connie, I'm going to mute you. These are all going up. Carbon dioxide is the greenhouse gas among all of these greenhouse gases. And it's the one that's important. It's pound for pound. Actually, carbon dioxide doesn't trap nearly as much heat as methane or nitrous oxide, but there's a lot more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and it lasts a lot longer. And so that's why so you can see the ppm is parts per million, while the other two are ppb, parts per billion. And that is that's an indicator that there's several orders of magnitude more carbon dioxide. So while it's not as potent pound for pound, there's so much more of it. It lasts for centuries, and that's why carbon dioxide continues to be the dominant greenhouse gas, the one that people pay attention to. Methane is becoming up to a level where it is important as well. We know that we're driving it by three ways. So we've understood the physics since the 1800s. The late 1800s, we determined at least carbon dioxide, they called it caloric acid at the time, or is capable of trapping greenhouse gases. The other way we know humans are driving is good old-fashioned science. We can't find an alternate explanation that holds water. So it's kind of the explanation. There are no alternative explanations in greenhouse other than greenhouse gases driving the warming that we see recently. And then even if we didn't know the first two, just the way that the atmosphere is warming is basically a smoking gun indicator, and we'll go into that here in just about 1 minute. So the first one, and this isn't a history lesson, I promise, but this is just a progression of the understanding from left to right in the folks in the fields of chemistry and physics. So an Irish physicist in the mid 1800s discovered that atmospheric gases absorb heat. Basically the Earth is a lot warmer than it would be without an atmosphere. And these greenhouse properties of atmospheric gases are what keep us warmer. And that was the discovery there. And then a Swedish chemist noticed in the very late 19th century, carbonic acid, I called it caloric acid, carbonic acid, that carbon dioxide, he did the first calculations based on the physical properties of these gases. This is how much heat, this much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere would trap. So he's the first person to really put numbers on that. And then Guy Callendar, kind of in the pre-war era, was the first to put more correct numbers on that. So the Swedish calculations were off a little bit. Guy Callendar kind of did the first modern version of numbers that stuck. And so our understanding, before there was a great deal of public discussion, there was a pretty clear line of scientific evolution of our understanding of what these greenhouse gases can do. This is speaking to that second. There's no other explanation. So what you're looking at, again, the past on the left, the close to the present on the right. You're looking at three different lines on this, and this is three things. So in green, this is the best of our scientific understanding, modeling that global temperature if we turned the humans off. So the green envelope is like the range of outcomes if we were to reconstruct the global temperature without all the additional greenhouse gases that we've added. And you can kind of see that remains relatively flat over the 20th century. The blue represents an exercise where they turned the humans back on and added the greenhouse gases and all of the physics involved in that. And the blue represents the number of kind of outcomes from those runs. And then the black is what we've actually observed. So there's really no way that we can recreate, using the knowledge that we have, the warming that we've seen in the black line without turning on the gases, the humans, as represented in the blue field. That's kind of the second scientific explanation. And then this is a little bit of an eye test, and it's not that important. The details are certainly not important, but the smoking gun is in the observation. So if we hadn't done 150 years worth of work understanding this stuff, the thing that would jump out to us as like someone like me as an observationalist and not someone that does climate modeling is the atmosphere is warming in different ways. So the lower atmosphere is on the left. So the layer of the atmosphere at the bottom of the atmosphere, the one that we live in, the first 25,000 feet or so of the atmosphere, is represented on the left. And you can see three categories of measurements of that part of the atmosphere. The top is radiosondes, or basically weather balloons over time. The middle panel shows how satellites show that the lower atmosphere is warmed over time. And then the bottom panel shows basically reanalysis, computer reconstructions, so modeling reconstructions. All three agree the lower part of the atmosphere is warming. The slope of that line is up as you go to the right. On the right is the lower stratosphere. It's the next layer up. It's like 25 to 60,000 feet up in the air. And it's where the most of the rest of the atmosphere is. And all three of those platforms, weather balloons, satellites, and computer reconstructions, all indicate that the stratosphere is cooling. And so we have the bottom part of the atmosphere warming and the top part of the atmosphere cooling. And you cannot explain that in any way without changing the composition of the atmosphere. You're trapping more heat lower in the atmosphere down here where we live and living things are at the expense of the temperatures in the upper atmosphere. And so even if we hadn't kind of anticipated this for 150 years, this would be a really telling example of what's going on. All right, thanks for the charts. Why does this matter? So we'll talk about extreme weather. So just a little bit of a literature review of the relationship between weather and climate. There's a great piece of literature in the 70s that was written that describe how weather and climate are related. And here it is. It was rocky. So whoops, I meant to go back. My bad. This guy's weather on the left and this guy's climate on the right. So weather throws the punches and does all the boxing. Climate trains the boxer. That's the relationship between big weather and climate. We don't know what punch Rocky's going to throw with 2 minutes and 4 seconds left in the 7th round of his next fight. But we know if we change the trainer to Mickey, he's going to throw a lot more left hooks over time. And that's the state of our knowledge right now, the relationship between climate change and certain types of big weather events like flooding. Flooding is happening more often. It's happening more frequently. The magnitude of floods are larger. It's difficult still to say this flood was caused by climate change or exactly how much climate change contributed to this flood. But when you pull back and you look at the statistics, it is clearly happening a lot more. Another way of looking at it is I have a teenage boy. He's an impulsive guy. He has inherited a short attention span from his old man. He's real sensitive to the world around him. He has influences in his world that shape his behavior pretty immediately. He can do extreme behavior if the right set of ingredients come together. And the kind of beautiful thing about him is when things go big, when things go extreme, he forgets quickly and moves on. And like a lot of teenage boys, certainly like I was. And if we hadn't named him something else, we would name him Weather. So this is how a climate scientist sees weather, is basically kind of a teenage boy of the climate system, does big things when the right ingredients come together. And that's under a stable climate, right? So that's under a climate that doesn't change. Weather can do big things even if there's not a changing climate. But if you change the climate, if you go to a new parent model, you can see that a teenage boy is still going to be impulsive. The weather's still going to respond to the kind of ingredients that come together. They're still going to be sensitive to things immediately around them, but the overall trajectory has changed. So changing the parental, the coach, the teacher, the mentor, this influential role over the weather changes how often and how severely these ingredients come together. So when you change the climate, you're not necessarily turning the dials on individual events, but you're bringing the ingredients that make big floods, big heat waves, really consequential hurricanes. You're changing the ingredients that cause those to come together in new ways. And for those things, they're coming together more often and more intensely. I'm going to go quickly through these vignettes, and then we'll get to a story and hand it to Kevin. Why does it matter? So climate and national security, we've lived through a decade where we saw some horrible violence over a 5 or 6 year period in Syria. And that was presented as a national security story, presented as a struggle for democracy and against an authoritarian government, and it was. But there was a climate piece to this that often is not appreciated. So just the setup. So this is a map of the nation of Syria as we know it, or at least we knew it this decade. And Eastern Syria, I grew up in Oklahoma, so Eastern Syria is kind of the agricultural part of Syria. It's a pretty dry place. They rely on water from the Euphrates to get a lot of their agriculture done. The economy and a lot of the jobs are based around agriculture. And so it is, to some extent, a little bit of the breadbasket for Syria anyway. The Syrian regime that was and is in place was a pretty nasty regime. So people out in the East were kind of marginalized folks that needed the climate to behave, to do the agriculture, to kind of keep themselves going, living under this regime. And then what happened was in the early part of the 2010s, this is the temperature in that part of the world in Eastern Syria. We saw this giant spike surrounded by several warm years and the associated drought. So really hot, unprecedented heat, significant drought. The water, the crops struggled. The nation of Turkey basically shut off most of the water flowing through the Euphrates, which made the situation even worse. And so you essentially had a farmers' rebellion in the East of already marginalized people, and you throw in some religious fervor into that, and it exploded into what we saw and dealt with in Syria. So there was a powder keg of longer-term systemic issues, but it was triggered by a climate event. It was a climate event that set this awful decade into motion into Syria. And if you go back into history, even recent history, when we have kind of modern techniques and precision agriculture, a lot of times climate events are the trigger for national security events. So it's not just it affects us in multiple ways. I'm going to skip through sea level rise. The bottom line is we deal with sea level rise mostly as a nuisance in the United States, and we see blue sky flooding, and it's a cost. So there's an economic cost to sea level rise, and as the seas rise on high tide events, we're getting ankle deep waters, and that's really hard on the infrastructure. It's hard on the economy. It's hard on people in coastal areas that work service jobs when they have to spend kind of days recovering from these nuisance flooding events. In parts of the rest of the world, this is an example of a terrible story from the New York Times of a Bangladeshi situation where this sea level saltwater intrusion basically started ruining the subsistence farms of those that lived along the coast. And this story was a kind of a family sketch of a woman whose husband passed away, and she had several kids and was not able to grow nearly enough food to meet their family's needs, and was essentially forced to pick which one of her sons she would have to kind of sell into servitude, essentially a modern version of kind of slave labor at a brick factory in Bangladesh. It's a terrible story, and so Bangladeshi subsistence farmers have very little to nothing to do with the climate change that is causing sea level rise, but they are bearing a lot of the consequences, the direct consequences of sea level rise. And you see this story over and over and over again. The people who are contributing the least to climate change are suffering the most from climate change. And it's very much like any issues of injustice, racial injustice, any other kinds of injustice. Typically, systems that we live in, when they change, and they change for the worse, they change first and fastest for those who are the most vulnerable and often have the least to do with setting up the problems in the first place. And climate is no different. All right, big rain is increasing. Another hazard that affects the marginalized. I worked with emergency management in Oklahoma for 15 years. We never worked an event where a flash flood, where a creek got up and really ran through the nice part of town. When we see flash flooding, the type of flooding that occurs in 10, 15 minutes and sweeps trailers away, the folks that are hurt and harmed and experience the most loss are not the folks with McMansions. They're folks who are on the margins, struggling with a lot of other issues as well. Flash flooding in particular is a hazard that is increasing in the east of the United States, and it is disproportionately increasing as a hazard against the poor and the uninformed. I will skip the big heat. What can we do about it? So we talk about mitigation and adaptation, and you'll hear these conversations often. And mitigation, generally speaking, when people talk about that, that's taking action to slow down the rate of global climate change. And that's often wrapped up in like energy policy, energy efficiency policy. We can make decisions at the individual level. We can make decisions at the institutional level. So we had a brief discussion right before we jumped into this about several houses of faith going solar, or at least partially going solar. And part of the motivation for that was that institution was taking steps to reduce their carbon footprint. And that has a lot bigger impact than changing light bulbs at the individual level. And then the next step up from personal to institutional is kind of the communal community policy level. And so we can deal with mitigation and adaptation at the individual level, institution, or community and policy level. Adaptation is the other side of that. So not really necessarily working on slowing down global climate change, but helping people deal with the consequences of that, helping living things deal with the consequences of that. So moving folks out of flood zones, providing better warning systems for floods in my old meteorological world, helping make better business and crop selection type decisions around the world when the climate is getting out from underneath the traditional crop. That's adaptation. That means recognizing that other parts of the world are dealing with slowing down climate change. Here's how we can help people cope with that. And so our ways to cope with climate change are necessarily a combination of these two. Yes, we want to slow it down. Yes, we want to stop it. But we also need to realize that we're committed to decades of climate change, and we need to help each other deal with it. And that's the language that you'll often hear. And I think both of those areas are ways where faith communities can really make a huge difference. I want to end with the story and then kind of a charge. So this is not really anything that directly deals with climate change or anything that's going on necessarily directly in your congregations. But it's a good story, and it's my story. And I want to share what it means when people get together to work on big, scary, seems like the end of the world kind of issues. I hinted at this. I grew up in Oklahoma. You know, a big part of our climate history. In the 1930s, we dealt with a dust bowl, a series of droughts and heat waves and dust storms that drove about a fifth of our population out of state, proportionally a larger migration than we saw from Syria. Obviously, Oklahomans had more freedom to leave than Syrians did, but we had this environmental catastrophe that had a climate driver. It was a drought, and mismanagement of soils basically made it a lot worse. And economic conditions, changing of agricultural labor practices, going to industrial tractor approaches rather than migrant laborers. So there's economic condition, this poor soil management condition. You get a good 5-year drought on top of that, and you get the catastrophe that they wrote novels about. And during the course of that, my grandmother is the little girl standing on your left, her right. That's my grandmother Vivian, and probably her little sister Gladys sitting on the lap of what I think is probably their birth mother, Ludi. And they went, my grandmother went through this era. This is from the 20s when things are a little better. So this is during the good times. And what happened to my grandmother was what happened to a lot of families in Oklahoma in the 30s. The times were too tough for Ludi to handle, and she kind of disappeared from the scene. And so 5 or 6 years after this picture was taken, my grandmother became the head of the household and was basically tasked with making it through a pretty desperate time while dragging her little sister around, as kind of a preteen and teenager. It was a rough time. It didn't go well. It was traumatic. She kind of bounced from place to place, cousin to cousin, relative to relative, friend, stranger, trying to make it through a pretty desperate time. And there were some bad men in her life, and she was kind of scarred by this experience for a long time. And she shared a lot of this with me in her last years. And that's a downer of a story. I promise it gets better. What happened to her seemed like the end of the world. There were huge changes going on all around her. It was a combination of the environment, the climate that she knew was changing, the social situation was changing, the economic situation was unraveling, and a lot of stuff was going bad. And so hundreds of thousands of families went through this similar terror. Her story was not unique. It was bad, but it was not unique. It was repeated hundreds of thousand times across the plains. But here's the part that you don't hear. And I want to share this with you because it's really important, is if you were to grab some of my climate science buddies and analyze the data and pick out the decade where all of these horrible things happened with drought and they wrote novels about it, the data jumps out at you. You can probably see it in this graph right in the middle. This is a drought index, a calculation that we do to measure the severity of drought for her part of Oklahoma. And you see this decade kind of really jumping out. And if you knew nothing about the history of Oklahoma, you would tag this as, that was the big one. But here's the deal. That wasn't the Dust Bowl. That's the 1950s that would jump out. And that's the decade that should have been the horrible decade that drove girls kind of into the wilderness and ignited a lot of really transformative, terrible experiences. The folks who went through the 50s went through a worse drought than what happened in the 30s. Something changed between the 30s and the 50s where there wasn't calamity associated with that drought. And the things that changed were a lot of what we think we do and say we do and encourage each other to do in houses of faith. It's taking care of each other. The changes that we went through in this 2-decade period was the haves and have-nots, the economic disparity that we saw in the 20s and 30s wasn't completely eradicated and not for all people, but it was a lot better in the 50s. The safety net that held up our most vulnerable was so much better developed. Lessons from the 30s. In Oklahoma, farming practices improved. We educated folks on how to conserve water, how to make better crop selections. All of the vulnerabilities of farming to the climate, we addressed, and we addressed through education that we provided. It wasn't just that scientists figured it out. Folks got out there and worked with people on how to adapt, how to be more resilient. And so my grandmother raised a family of 4 kids. One of those kids was my mom in a farm town in Oklahoma, going through technically a worse drought than she did in the 30s. And that family didn't fall apart. It didn't go to pieces like hers did in the 30s. And I'm a direct beneficiary of that investment that so many people made in improving the lives and resilience of the folks that came before me in my family. If you get nothing more out of this depressing kind of set of stories and graphs, I want you to know, faith communities are really positioned to help, because faith communities, way more than any other institutions in America, think long-term. They think about generations. And I want to tell you from my personal experience and my reflection on this story that the the things that they were doing in the 30s and 40s that prepared us for the 50s may have seemed like we were healing a wound. And a lot of what we do in climate change, we're motivated to heal a wound. But the healing of that wound is also an investment that pays dividends for generations in making things better for people. I would not be on this screen spouting out big words with my fancy formal education if it hadn't been for the investments that people made in people like my grandmother. And it has paid off for 75 years since. I'm eternally grateful. You and your communities do that kind of work all the time. If you want to do it in the area of climate, you are so well equipped to do that. I will have to Kevin to follow up with that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Deke, for sharing both all of your wisdom and your knowledge of what's happening in the world, and especially that story. And as you all probably got from the first conversation where I talked a little bit about my daughter in the garden, I think that storytelling is really important. And so what Deke did for us just now was what I believe is a way of helping us begin to reframe what's happening in the world right now. Because we can begin from a place of all the knowledge that we have, and a lot of us, I mean, if you're like me, I love the science stuff. I'm also not very good at following it. And so I just have to trust people like Deke and say, hey, they know what's going on. But what I know what's going on is I know stories. And as I mentioned earlier, I think we can begin to reframe what's happening in terms of relationships. So in the Judeo-Christian tradition, there's this beautiful story that comes from Genesis 2, which I shared a little bit about earlier. And it's in this story, there's this image of God as a loving gardener. And God is not standing way up in heaven, creating and sort of images that we get in the first Genesis 1 story. But in Genesis 2, God is standing and kneeling maybe in the dirt, in the soil. And God is taking God's hands and cultivating soil. And I can imagine even bringing it up to God's face and kissing it, breathing life into it. And we're told in Genesis that out of this soil, God creates humans, creates you and me and all the creatures. But not just human beings, not just people, but literally that God creates all the animals, all the living things from this same soil. I think it's neat that like we're beginning to catch on to what God was doing here. Science has told us now that we share a common bond with the rest of creation, with literally the soil, the dirt. I heard once, and again, my statistics aren't probably nearly as good as, I know they're not as good as Deke's, but I heard once that our DNA is about 98.8% the same as a chimpanzee. It's about 80% the same as a dog, and about 60% the same as a fruit fly. I mean, when someone tells me that, what I hear is, oh my goodness, we share this deep interconnection that Genesis has been talking about from the very beginning. It's little wonder, even when I hear things that like our bodies are made of 70% water, just like the earth, it doesn't surprise me anymore. It's as if like science has caught up to what the scriptures and St. Francis and others who said things like this, that there's a miracle out there. And this miracle of love is to discover that all creation is one, that we are indeed made for communion together and right relationship. And from the beginning, I think our theologies and our stories from all sorts of faith traditions tell us that we are deeply interconnected. And the story that Deke has been sharing with us is a story of brokenness, right? It's a broken relationship. If I were to interpret all of those graphs in the best way that I could, I would say that it is a story of broken relationships, a brokenness between land and animals and people, between those who have and those who do not, between people of different colors and races, there is a brokenness that has happened. And if we were to read the rest of the Genesis story, we'd find out exactly why. As our relationship with God becomes broken in the garden, so too does our relationship with the creation. We get a story of how Adam and Eve are cast out from the garden, and we're told that now the land and the animals will be hostile to them. And when this relationship becomes broken between humans and God and humans and the creation, it follows simply that that relationship between humans and other humans will become broken. And this is what happens in the very next chapter of Genesis. We get the story of Cain and Abel, a brother killing a brother. I think all of this names how deeply connected things are. And if we are to love God, then we must love the creation and we must love one another. And if we are to love one another, then we must love the creation and love God. And if we are to love people, then we must love the creation and love God. Each relationship flows in the other direction. So the question I often get asked is, where do we go from here? You know, we've heard sort of where we're at, what time it is in the world. And theologically speaking, what time is it right now? What are we as faith communities supposed to do? Well, thankfully, as we've sort of followed Genesis in chapter 2 and chapter 3, well, just soon after, there's another story, a story that many of us have heard time and time again. It's a story of Noah and an ark. Well, we eventually end up in this story with this climactic proclamation from God that every inclination of the human heart was evil all the time. I mean, we went through the last 4 years. We kind of know that every inclination of the human heart seems to be evil all around us. We seem to see a lot of the hurt and pain that we're causing to one another, just like in this story. But in the story of Noah, we learn that humans have turned against one another, that they've begun to exploit one another. They've exploited the land and the people and animals for personal gain. And in the wake of these destructive habits, God's heart is saddened. God even laments over ever creating human beings. And we know where the story goes from here. There's a flood, there's an ark, there's Noah and his family who are aboard this ark, and there's animals who are 2 by 2 and 7 by 7. And as a child, when I was told this story, I was always told of it that this ark was sort of an escape vessel. It was the way in which Noah and these animals would escape destruction. But the reality is the ancient rabbis didn't always see the ark in this sort of way. Instead of an escape vessel, some rabbis saw it as a school in which human beings could learn to care for and love the creation once again. They saw the ark as a place where we could become caretakers and stewards in the way that God intended us to be from the beginning. So I want you to think about that for a moment. If you were Noah, or just part of Noah's family, what would it have taken for you to have kept all those animals alive on the ark? I mean, how would you even know what to feed them? I think about that for a moment, and I have successfully kept alive 3 cats and 5 chickens for about 2 years now. So I feel like I know how to feed a few animals, and I've kept alive a child for 2 years. So I feel like I'm doing great here. But if I begin to ask the question, what do hippos eat? I go, I don't know. I mean, what do hippos eat? What do fruit flies eat? What do chimpanzees eat? Bananas? I really don't know. And how often do they eat? And when do they eat? Morning, evening, nighttime? I think you begin to get the idea. Just keeping the animals alive on the ark and feeding them would have been a steep learning curve for Noah. To do so, Noah would have had to learn, to get to know the creatures on the ark. He'd have to learn their needs, their habits, their desires. And thinking on this, some of those ancient rabbis commented that Noah must have never slept. And if any of you have had children and you remember what it's like in those first year or two, you remember you don't do a whole lot of sleeping because you're up and you're feeding and you're caring for the needs because you want to see that child not just live, but thrive. And you give your heart completely to the task because you love that child. And so these rabbis said Noah must have loved those creatures, those animals on the ark in the same way. He must have fallen in love with them because how else could they have not only survived, but thrived? I think the story of Noah's Ark is a story about learning how to fall in love with creation again. If we really want to be good stewards and caretakers of this world that God has made, then I think our relationship has to be defined by love, because simply telling people they should care enough is never gonna be enough. Help them fall in love and it'll change everything. As the 12th century Christian mystic and poet Hildegard of Bingen once said, if we fall in love with creation deeper and deeper, then and only then will we respond to creation's endangerment with passion. I love that. If you fall in love, you'll respond in passion. To paraphrase Baba Dioma, a Sinhalese environmentalist, we won't save places we don't know or we don't love, and we can't love places we don't know. And we don't know places we haven't learned. So that's, we won't save places we don't love. We can't love places we don't know, and we don't know places we haven't learned. So while it might sound naive, I think that the response of people of faith is this, that if we want to be good stewards of the earth, if we want to do something about climate change, then we can't simply change light bulbs or lobby for better energy policy. As good and important as those things are, and trust me, if you're a faith community doing that, hooray, and more power to you, be a part of that. But I think what we have to do is we have to begin by seeing and noticing once again. We have to become students of the creation who have learned to delight in it. You know, my co-pastor, who's a minister with me out here in the Upper Swannanoa River watershed, he was someone who always believed that we should care for the creation because God told us to. That's kind of how he grew up in the Christian faith. And I talked to him about this idea of falling in love with creation, and I remember him going, well, that sounds great and all, but like, how do we do that? And so we began to take a walk after we were actually on the campus of Warren Wilson, and we were walking around, and he found this tree, this like beautiful sprawling tree. And as we were walking, we were like, why don't we sit under this tree? And then as we were sitting, this co-pastor of mine, who's a few years older than me, he said, you know what? It's been a long time since I've climbed a tree. So he began to climb the tree, and he got up halfway up the tree and found this perfect spot to sit down. And then sitting down became lying down, which became a nap. And he told me after he woke up, after laying on that tree, he's like, you know, this is the first time I can truly say, I love this tree. I actually love it. I don't know if I've ever said that about any of the creation before. I cared about it, but I think I'm falling in love with it. I think there's something to that. Like the story I told earlier about my daughter in the garden eating a fresh, warm strawberry, or my friend falling in love with a tree that he falls asleep on. I wonder, when was the last time you have delighted like that? Delighting is a discipline that many of us have forgotten and we left behind in our childhoods. We've left behind our sense of awe and wonder. We've become jaded and we've given in to cynicism. But the truth is, of all these stories that Deke has shared and that I've shared with you now, The truth is, cynicism won't save us. Only love can do that. Love lived out with justice and right relationship practice. So it's my hope that this day, that we might all learn how to delight in the creation once again. And in delighting, my prayer is that you'll find yourself falling in love. Because as Hildegard and people like Francis remind us, it's only from this place of love that we can truly respond in passion to the endangerment of the creation. So in the time we have left together, I'd like to just open up a space in which you can either share with Deke or some of the questions, because he's your guy to ask all the important questions, all the good things. If you want to ask some questions for him, or if you want to simply talk about what it might look like to fall in love with the creation. I think there's beautiful ways that our churches and our synagogues and our mosques and other places are doing that. And so if you want to even share some of those stories, I just want to open up these last few minutes of space for stories or questions.
Deke, could I ask you a question, please?
Yes, sir.
You presented a chart of temperature change in the mainland USA,
Yes.
and it appeared that some areas are actually showing a decrease in temperature.
Yes.
That's kind of puzzling.
Yeah, the deep south in particular. So kind of the states along the coast, what we would call the deep south, stretching into the mid south, is not warming. Some parts of Alabama are actually cooling. That was a little bit of a dated map. That was from the 4th National Climate Assessment, which is about 5 years old. It's flattened out a little bit since then. If you're kind of asking an implicit question like what's going on there, why is that? It's not kind of anchored in climate science yet. You know, we're a pretty conservative group. We don't kind of run with the answer until it's been beat up a whole bunch. But what appears to be the best explanation of that, and what I personally think will end up playing out, the Gulf of Mexico itself has warmed quite a bit, and we're seeing a lot more rainfall and cloud cover in the southeast. So the southeast, as a consequence of kind of the moisture coming from a warmer body of water borne into the region on southerly winds from the ocean, has become a cloudier, rainier place, and so that's kind of counteracted the general warming trend that we see elsewhere.
Okay, thank you.
You bet.
Dick, this is Jane, and I have a question for you.
Yep.
So with climate change, with warming, there's more water in the atmosphere. And with more water in the atmosphere, there's more cloud cover. Mm-hmm. So my concern is we're putting up all these solar panels, and I'm wondering if we are not going to get the yield we're expecting because of this increased cloud cover.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know the answer. The increased cloud is showing up in different parts of the world in different ways. So some places, and this is the case, we think with the southeast, is the increased cloud has kind of showed up in the form of lower clouds, more convective clouds, rain producing clouds, and those do block out quite a bit of the incoming sunlight. In other parts of the world, we're seeing more high clouds. They actually have a warming effect because the sunlight pretty much comes through, and then they help to trap the outgoing heat as well. I do know, with all that said, one anecdote. So I'm telling one data point, which is totally against my training as a scientist. I know at St. Eugene, we realized a greater benefit than we had planned for with our solar panel installation. So it was slightly better than we expected. I think we were pretty conservative in kind of running the numbers, but we saw, just from an economic bottom line standpoint, we were able to make a little more electricity than we had counted on.
Deke, Dick Enrique Sanchez.
Yes.
That is the same that we noticed in Trinity since we installed the panels 2 years ago, until we had the oddity of 2020 when we closed the church. But until the closing of the church, which we know is COVID related, we also got more benefit than what we had expected, but it is short term.
Thank you, Enrique.
Kevin, how can we inspire awe and wonder in congregations?
So I think one of the ways that we can do that is, sorry, the strawberry eater has entered the room. You want to come up here and say hi? No. Here, come up here and say hi. Nope, no, not. So I think one of the ways that we can inspire our congregations is to simply get them outside again. So one of the ways in which, like, my faith community, we've actually completely moved outside. We are a church community that has no building, has no walls, and we meet outside in the creation. In doing that, you begin to get to know that, like, okay, I'm going to be uncomfortable. You get used to being uncomfortable a little bit. In my previous congregation that I served, we had a beautiful church, beautiful building. It's wonderful and great. But we also, like, decided how much of the creation we let inside. So, you know, the windows always had the blinds closed because we didn't want sunlight fading the carpet. It was never more like colder than 68 degrees. Really, it was 68 to 72 degrees all the time in that sanctuary. We decided how warm or how cold we wanted it to be. No flowers or anything except for the ones that we would bring in. And in doing that, we created a sense of both a theology of comfort, but we also created a theology in which we always were the host to the creation, rather than seeing the creation as hosting us. And we created a theology in which people were the very center of the church, rather than seeing all the rest of creation as a co-congregant in our worship. And we know from the scriptures that you know, the creation is already singing out. And if you go worship outside, you're going to notice birds are going to start getting in your way. So many times we've had dogs show up at our worship unexpectedly. Someone's walking their dog and they're like, oh, a bunch of people gathered around, so I'm going to go run in there. And then you realize that, like, wow, there's more happening here than just me. I think that's part of the way that we begin this. Or just encouraging people to get outside. We've got a lovely scavenger hunt that the Creation Care Alliance has, that I'm sure we can share out there, where people can simply invite especially during COVID, invite your families to go find some of these native creatures that are native to our part of the state in Western North Carolina. And there's some ways in which you can get to know those creatures. So I think that's part of the way, and inviting people to do things that they've long forgotten how to do.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think Carol raised your hand.
Okay, I forgot to unmute. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I'm sorry. Yes, I really was impressed with the data you showed us, and I wondered how much of those data were public and we could have. I'm thinking particularly, for example, of a pretty thoughtful man in our church, I should say, who believes climate change is occurring, but he absolutely doesn't believe that humans caused it. And if you talk to him about it, and I don't very much because it's too difficult, but he'll give some examples from history, you know, back maybe hundreds or something. I mean, some examples to show that we had the climate change going on all the time. I would love to share some of these data, but I assume they're not published yet, or some of them aren't, or what could I do to get some that it's okay to get?
Yeah, great. So I am sharing this presentation with Susan Bean from Mountain True, so you can get the actual presentation. Most of the data comes from the State of the Climate Report, which is kind of a technical sort of annual physical of the climate system. And then there's a much, and I'm in charge of the State of Climate Report. There's a much more readable version. It doesn't come out every year, called the National Climate Assessment, globalchange.gov. And that is a much more, it's in English. It's not written in science. It's written in English. But I understand this, the argument that a lot of people make the argument that, well, there's been wildfires forever, so the church couldn't have burned down because of arson, right? And they take that argument and they say, well, climate's always changed forever, so what we're going through right now can't be driven by humans. And the fact is, climate has seen changes, but we understand all of the changes we've seen in the past, and this doesn't fit all of those changes. It's a frustrating argument. The batting average of getting through to people making those arguments is pretty small, so don't be discouraged. Don't feel like you have to convince this one skeptic to go out and do good in the world, but there's certainly kind of data that helps speak to it.
The more readable report that you said, does it have a URL? You give the name?
Yeah, yeah. It's the National Climate Assessment. It's published every 4 years out of Asheville, actually, and globalchange.gov is the URL.
Okay. Thank you so much.
You bet. All right. I want to thank everyone for their time. I want to thank Kevin for your inspiration. This is always listening to you is wonderful, really changes perspective. I want to express kind of on behalf of the whole, well, what you're doing is great. Investing your time in our faith-driven stewardship and relationship with each other and the world around us is beautiful and inspiring. And like I said, it's long lasting. Your investment in these relationships among us and between us and the world we live in are long lasting. Please keep the faith and have a wonderful rest of the meeting. Kevin, you want to send us home?
Yeah, I want to thank you all again for joining us here, and just want to echo what Deke is saying. I'm grateful for Deke and for his willingness to always. I told Scott, I was like, I'll only do it if Deke's willing to share that story again of his grandmother in Oklahoma. I think that it's just so beautiful. I'm grateful for that. It has changed my perspective of things, and I hope too that you'll take these stories and that you'll add your own, that you will join your voices into these stories that continue to share, that continue to inspire and move us in this direction of love towards the creation. So thank you all, and I guess we'll. Jane, I don't know if there's anything else here, but I guess we'll send you all from here and invite you on to lunch. And I know Maureen has set up a sort of prayer walking through this time of eating together. But if not, we will see you in just a few hours. So thank you all.